Tonight, we explore the lives and legacies of the most wicked women in Roman history. The kind of women who poisoned emperors, manipulated sons into monsters, and bathed in the blood of their enemies. From mothers who murdered their own children to empresses who turned the palace into a brothel. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. From sisters who declared war on their brothers to wives who fed their husbands to the lions. These women didn't just break moral boundaries, they obliterated them entirely, leaving behind a trail of corpses, shattered dynasties, and an empire stained with their cruelty. They were the architects of Rome's darkest chapters, the puppet masters behind its most brutal tyrants, and the living embodiments of evil wrapped in silk and jewels. In the marble halls of ancient Rome, where power flowed like wine and death lurked behind every smile, there lived a woman whose very name would become synonymous with calculated evil. Livia Drusilla was not born to darkness, yet she would craft it into an art form, painting the walls of the imperial palace with the blood of innocents and the tears of mothers who would never see their sons again. When historians speak of Rome's most dangerous women, they whisper Livia's name with a mixture of awe and revulsion. She was the prototype, the original architect of imperial murder, the woman who showed future empresses that the path to ultimate power was paved with the bones of family members and innocent children. For over 5 decades she wore the mask of the perfect Roman matron, while orchestrating what may have been the most successful serial killing spree in human history. Livia's ascent began with scandal that should have destroyed her. She was married to Tiberius Claudius Nero, pregnant with his child when she caught the eye of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. What followed was a divorce so rushed, so unprecedented in its haste, that even Rome's jaded elite raised their eyebrows. Within 3 days of giving birth to her second son, Livia found herself married to the most powerful man in the known world. It was not love that drove this union, but something far more sinister. The recognition of a kindred spirit, a meeting of 2 minds equally capable of the coldest calculation. Augustus believed he had found the perfect wife, a woman of apparent virtue who would serve as the moral foundation of his new empire. What he had actually done was invite a viper into his bed, a creature so cunning that she would spend the next 50 years slowly devouring his entire bloodline, while he watched unknowing and grateful for her presence. The murders began almost immediately, though they were so subtle, so perfectly disguised as natural deaths, that even Augustus himself never suspected. Livia understood that patience was the greatest weapon in her arsenal. She did not strike quickly, or obviously. Instead, she planted seeds of death that would bloom years later, always with plausible explanations, always beyond suspicion. Marcellus, Augustus's beloved nephew and first chosen heir, was just 21 when he fell ill with a mysterious fever. The young man had been robust, healthy, beloved by the people, a shining symbol of Rome's future. His death devastated Augustus, who mourned him as the son he never had. But while the emperor wept, Livia watched with cold satisfaction. The first obstacle to her son Tiberius's path to power had been removed. Next came Gaius Caesar, Augustus's grandson, a charismatic young man who commanded legions and captured hearts across the empire. He died at 24 in distant Armenia, officially from wounds received in battle. But those who knew Livia's methods suspected something more sinister. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too perfect. Another rival eliminated, another step closer to her ultimate goal. Lucius Caesar followed his brother into the grave at 19, supposedly succumbing to illness while traveling to Spain. By now, a pattern was emerging that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. Every potential heir to Augustus, every young man who stood between Tiberius and the throne was dying. Yet Augustus, blinded by grief and perhaps by Livia's careful manipulations, saw only tragic coincidence where others might have seen deliberate malice. The deaths continued with methodical precision. Agrippa Postumus, Augustus's last surviving grandson, was executed on charges of violent insanity that appeared suddenly and conveniently just as Augustus was considering him as an heir. Even Augustus's own daughter Julia fell victim to Livia's schemes, exiled on trumped-up charges of adultery that may have been orchestrated to remove her from the succession entirely. But Livia's masterpiece, the crime that would cement her legacy as Rome's greatest monster, was the murder of Augustus himself. The emperor had begun to grow suspicious in his final years, perhaps finally recognizing the pattern of deaths that surrounded his wife. He had started to reconsider his will, to think about alternatives to Tiberius. This could not be allowed. The method was as elegant as it was horrifying. Augustus had a simple pleasure in his old age. He loved the fresh figs that grew in his private garden, tending them himself as a respite from the burdens of empire. Livia discovered this weakness and exploited it with characteristic cunning. She began painting select figs with a tasteless, odorless poison, always the ones growing highest on the tree, the ones Augustus would have to reach for, the sweetest and most tempting. For weeks she fed her husband death in small doses, watching as he weakened, as his legendary vitality drained away. When Augustus finally collapsed after his morning meal of fresh figs, Livia was at his side, the perfect picture of a devoted wife in mourning. She held his hand as he died, whispering words of love while inside. She celebrated the completion of her life's work. The empire Augustus had built to last 1,000 years became Tiberius's inheritance, exactly as Livia had planned from the moment she first set foot in the palace. She had murdered her way to the ultimate prize, transforming her son from an unwanted stepchild into the most powerful man on earth. The cost was immeasurable. Dozens of lives snuffed out, bloodlines ended, the future of Rome itself twisted to serve one woman's ambition. When Tiberius took the throne, Livia expected to rule beside him, to finally claim the open power she had wielded in secret for so long. But even monsters sometimes create children who despise them. Tiberius knew what his mother was, knew the price that had been paid for his crown. He spent the rest of his reign trying to escape her shadow, eventually fleeing Rome itself rather than remain in the presence of the woman who had made him emperor through mass murder. Livia Drusilla died in her bed, surrounded by honors and public mourning, remembered by history as Augusta, the mother of the empire. But those who knew the truth understood that she was something far more terrible, the woman who had taught Rome that family meant nothing when power was at stake, that love was just another weapon to be wielded, and that sometimes the greatest monsters were the ones who smiled the sweetest while they destroyed everything you held dear. If Livia Drusilla was the architect of imperial murder, then Agrippina the Younger was her most devoted student, a woman who took her predecessors' lessons in cruelty and refined them into something even more horrifying. She was born into the very heart of Roman power, the daughter of the beloved general Germanicus and the granddaughter of Augustus himself. Yet rather than using her privileged position to serve Rome, Agrippina would transform it into a weapon of mass destruction, ultimately unleashing upon the world one of history's most sadistic tyrants, while claiming the title of loving mother. Agrippina's education in evil began early, watching as her own mother, Agrippina the Elder, was slowly destroyed by the paranoid Emperor Tiberius. She learned that in the imperial family, sentiment was suicide and mercy was weakness. When Tiberius had her mother starved to death in exile, young Agrippina absorbed the lesson that power respected only power, and that those who showed compassion would inevitably become victims themselves. The first glimpse of Agrippina's true nature came during the reign of her brother Caligula, when Rome discovered that the imperial family's corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Ancient sources speak in hushed tones of the incestuous relationship between Caligula and his sisters, a scandal so profound that even Rome's jaded elite were shocked. Agrippina was not merely a victim of her brother's twisted desires. She was an active participant, using their unnatural bond to secure wealth, influence, and valuable lessons in manipulation. When Caligula was assassinated and her uncle Claudius stumbled onto the throne, Agrippina saw her opportunity. Claudius was bookish, awkward, easily manipulated by those who understood his weaknesses. Agrippina seduced him with calculated precision, playing the role of devoted niece while plotting to become his wife. The fact that such a marriage would be incestuous by Roman law was merely another obstacle to overcome. Through a combination of sexual manipulation and political maneuvering, Agrippina convinced Claudius to change the laws of Rome itself to permit their union. She became not just his wife but his equal, appearing on coins beside the emperor, reading his correspondence, attending Senate meetings. For the first time in Roman history, a woman openly wielded imperial power, and she used that power to begin orchestrating what would become her masterpiece of evil. Agrippina's obsession was her son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom history would remember by his adopted name Nero. From the moment she married Claudius, every decision Agrippina made was calculated to place this child on the throne, regardless of the cost in human life or the damage to the empire itself. She began by systematically eliminating Claudius's advisors and replacing them with her own creatures, men who understood that their continued existence depended entirely on supporting her son's claim to power. She forced Claudius to adopt Nero as his heir, bypassing his own biological son Britannicus. She arranged for Nero to marry Claudius's daughter Octavia, binding the boy ever closer to the imperial family through bonds of adoption and marriage. But perhaps most chillingly, Agrippina began Nero's education in cruelty from the earliest age. She hired Seneca, the philosopher, to teach him rhetoric and statecraft, but she herself taught him lessons far more sinister. She showed him how to identify weakness in others and exploit it. She demonstrated the pleasure that could be found in others' pain. She nurtured in him a complete absence of empathy that would serve him well as emperor and make him one of history's most reviled tyrants. When Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate son, began to show promise and win his father's affection, Agrippina recognized the threat immediately. The boy was intelligent, charismatic, beloved by the people. If he lived to maturity, he might challenge Nero's claim to the throne. This could not be permitted. Working with Locusta, a professional poisoner whose services she had used before, Agrippina began experimenting with different methods of murder. They tested various poisons on slaves and prisoners, refining their techniques until they discovered a compound that would kill quickly but leave no obvious trace. When the time was right, Britannicus would simply collapse during a meal, apparently the victim of natural illness. But first there was the matter of Claudius himself. The emperor had begun to show signs of favoring his biological son over his adopted heir. He had started questioning some of Agrippina's more blatant power grabs. There were rumors that he was considering changing his will. Agrippina realized that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The murder of Claudius was planned with meticulous care. Agrippina knew his habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. She discovered that he had a particular fondness for mushrooms, especially those prepared by his food taster, a slave named Locusta, whom Agrippina had secretly corrupted. The poison was applied to the most delicious specimens, ensuring that Claudius would consume a fatal dose while believing he was enjoying a favorite delicacy. Claudius died in agony, his body convulsing as the poison coursed through his system. Agrippina held his hand and whispered words of comfort while internally celebrating the success of her plan. Within hours, 16-year-old Nero was proclaimed emperor, and Agrippina stood beside him as the real power behind the throne. Initially, Agrippina ruled through her son with an iron fist. She controlled access to him, read his correspondence, made decisions in his name. She had achieved her ultimate goal, wielding the power of an emperor while maintaining the fiction that she was merely a devoted mother supporting her child. But Agrippina had underestimated the monster she had created. Nero had learned his lessons in cruelty too well. As he matured, he began to resent his mother's control, to chafe at her attempts to manage his every decision. The student was preparing to surpass the teacher, and Agrippina was too blinded by her own success to recognize the danger until it was far too late. The woman who had murdered her way to ultimate power would soon discover that in training her son to be the perfect tyrant, she had signed her own death warrant. Among the pantheon of Rome's most depraved rulers, few names evoke such visceral disgust as Valeria Messalina, the third wife of Emperor Claudius, and perhaps the most sexually voracious and politically destructive woman in the empire's history. While other empresses schemed in shadows and killed with poison, Messalina destroyed lives with an appetite for flesh that was matched only by her thirst for power. She transformed the imperial palace into a brothel, the Roman court into an orgy, and the very concept of imperial dignity into a grotesque parody that would stain Rome's reputation for generations. Messalina was born into the highest ranks of Roman nobility, blessed with beauty that men would kill for, and a political pedigree that opened every door in the empire. When she married Claudius, she was barely 17, a vision of youthful innocence that masked a soul already corrupted by absolute entitlement and an insatiable hunger for sensation. Claudius, awkward and bookish, believed he had found the perfect wife to grace his court and bear his children. What he had actually done was unleash a sexual predator upon Rome itself. From the moment she became empress, Messalina began systematically destroying every boundary that separated civilization from chaos. She did not merely take lovers, she collected them like trophies, gathering senators, gladiators, actors and slaves into an ever-expanding web of sexual exploitation. Her appetite was not driven by love or even lust, but by a pathological need to dominate and humiliate others through the most intimate of violations. The stories of Messalina's excesses became legend throughout the empire, whispered in taverns and recorded by historians who struggled to find words adequate to describe her depravity. She would appear at gladiator schools, selecting the most handsome fighters for private audiences that left them either elevated to positions of unearned power or destroyed entirely when they failed to satisfy her demands. She frequented the lowest brothels in Rome, not as a customer, but as a competitor, challenging professional prostitutes to contests of endurance that she invariably won through sheer inhuman persistence. Perhaps the most infamous of these competitions was recorded by Pliny the Elder, who wrote of Messalina's challenge to Sylla, Rome's most celebrated courtesan. The contest was to see who could service more men in a single night, from sunset to sunrise. While Sylla, exhausted after 25 encounters, collapsed in defeat, Messalina continued for hours more, ultimately claiming victory with a count that historians have deemed too shocking to record in detail. She did not celebrate this triumph privately. but made it known throughout Rome, reveling in the scandal and the fear it inspired in decent citizens. But Messalina's sexual appetite was merely the most visible aspect of a deeper corruption that threatened the very foundations of Roman government. She weaponized her sexuality, using her body as a tool of political manipulation that corrupted everyone it touched. Senators found themselves compromised by affairs they had not sought, their votes controlled by a woman who held their reputations hostage. Military commanders discovered that their careers depended not on their service to Rome, but on their willingness to submit to Messalina's desires. She established a network of informants and blackmailers throughout the city, building files of compromising information that she used to destroy anyone who opposed her will. Wealthy citizens found themselves accused of treason based on evidence provided by slaves whom Messalina had seduced and corrupted. Marriages were destroyed when wives discovered their husbands' involuntary entanglements with the empress. Children were orphaned when their fathers were executed on charges fabricated from Messalina's twisted imagination. The empress's cruelty extended far beyond sexual manipulation. She took pleasure in the suffering of others, ordering executions for the entertainment value they provided. She would attend gladiator games and demand that defeated fighters be killed regardless of their skill or the crowd's wishes, simply because she enjoyed watching the light fade from their eyes. She collected exotic animals not for their beauty but for the creative ways they could be used to torture her enemies. One of her most grotesque innovations was the use of sexual humiliation as a form of execution. Political prisoners would be forced to participate in degrading performances before their deaths, their final moments transformed into entertainment for Messalina and her court. She took particular pleasure in destroying women who had once been considered virtuous, forcing them to commit acts that would shame their families for generations before finally granting them the mercy of death. As her power grew, so did her audacity. Messalina began to believe that she was above all law, all custom, all moral restraint. She started appearing publicly in costumes that mocked religious ceremonies, portraying herself as various goddesses while engaging in acts that would have been considered sacrilegious even in Rome's permissive society. She commissioned statues and paintings depicting her sexual conquests, decorating public buildings with images that shocked even the most jaded citizens. The beginning of the end came when Messalina's ambitions exceeded even her considerable abilities. Drunk on power and convinced of her own invincibility, she made the fatal error of attempting to formalize her relationship with Gaius Silius, a handsome senator who had become her most prominent lover. While Claudius was away from Rome on official business, Messalina entered into a marriage ceremony with Silius, complete with religious rites and public celebration. Whether this ceremony was intended as a symbolic gesture, a political coup, or simply another expression of Messalina's contempt for convention, it represented a crossing of the final line that separated scandal from treason. An empress could not marry another man while the emperor lived. This was not mere adultery, but an act of rebellion that threatened the very foundation of imperial authority. When news of the ceremony reached Claudius, the emperor finally awakened to the monster he had married. The woman he had cherished as a devoted wife was revealed as a creature of such depravity that she had transformed his court into a cesspit of corruption and his reign into a laughingstock throughout the empire. The reckoning that followed would be swift, brutal, and final. In the dying days of the Roman Republic, when the old ways crumbled and ambitious men carved the world between them with swords, there emerged a woman whose appetite for violence and political destruction would make even the most hardened generals recoil in horror. Fulvia Flacca Bambula was not content to manipulate from the shadows or poison her enemies in private. She was a creature of open warfare, a woman who took personal pleasure in the sight of blood and the sounds of dying men, transforming the noble art of politics into a carnival of sadistic brutality. Born into one of Rome's most prestigious families, Fulvia possessed every advantage that wealth and breeding could provide. She was intelligent, charismatic, and beautiful enough to capture the attention of the most powerful men in the Republic. But beneath this aristocratic facade lurked something monstrous, a hunger for domination that could never be satisfied through conventional means. Where other women of her class sought influence through charm and alliance, Fulvia craved the intoxicating rush of absolute power over life and death. Her path to infamy began with her marriages, each one a calculated step toward greater violence and chaos. Her first husband, Publius Claudius Pulcher, was one of Rome's most notorious demagogues, a man who used street gangs and political terrorism to advance his career. Under Fulvia's influence, his already violent methods became exponentially more brutal. She encouraged him to escalate his conflicts, to respond to political opposition with assassination rather than debate. She personally recruited thugs and killers for his cause, selecting them not just for their effectiveness but for their willingness to inflict maximum suffering on their victims. When Claudius was murdered by his rival Milo in 52 BC, Fulvia's response revealed the true depths of her depravity. Rather than grieving privately or seeking justice through legal means, she transformed her husband's funeral into a grotesque spectacle of vengeance. She displayed his mutilated corpse to the crowds, pointing out each wound while delivering speeches that whipped the mob into a murderous frenzy. She demanded that the assembled masses swear oaths of blood revenge, and when they hesitated, she produced a dagger and cut her own flesh, letting her blood drip onto her husband's body while screaming curses upon his enemies. The riot that followed consumed half of Rome. Buildings were burned, senators were attacked in the streets, and dozens of innocent people died in the chaos that Fulvia had orchestrated. She moved through the destruction like a goddess of war, her white dress stained with blood, directing the violence with gestures and shouts. Witnesses reported that she laughed as she watched a group of Milo's supporters being beaten to death, their screams of agony providing her with a satisfaction that no amount of wealth or luxury could match. Her second marriage to Gallius Scribonius Curio brought even greater opportunities for destruction. Curio was deeply in debt and politically desperate, making him the perfect instrument for Fulvia's increasingly ambitious schemes. She convinced him to sell his loyalty to Julius Caesar, but not out of any political conviction. Fulvia had recognized that the Republic was dying, and that the future belonged to those willing to embrace total war. She wanted to be at the center of that conflict, to help tear down the old world with her own hands. Under Fulvia's guidance, Curio became one of Caesar's most effective agents in destabilizing the Republic. She helped him identify senators who could be blackmailed or bribed, provided him with intelligence gathered through her network of spies and informants, and most chillingly gave him lists of political enemies who needed to be eliminated. When Curio died fighting Caesar's wars in North Africa, Fulvia mourned not the man but the loss of a useful tool in her campaign of destruction. It was her third marriage to Mark Antony that would give Fulvia the platform she needed to fully unleash her capacity for evil upon the world. Antony was everything she had been searching for, powerful, violent, and ambitious enough to match her own hunger for dominance. Together, they formed a partnership that would drench the Mediterranean world in blood and bring the Roman Republic to its knees. When Caesar was assassinated and the Second Triumvirate was formed, Fulvia finally had access to the kind of power she had always craved. The proscription lists that condemned hundreds of senators and wealthy citizens to death were not merely political necessities to her, they were opportunities for artistic expression. She personally reviewed each name, savoring the details of how each victim would be hunted down and killed. She demanded that the severed heads of the condemned be brought to her for inspection, examining them like trophies while planning the fates of the next group of victims. The most notorious example of Fulvia's sadistic creativity involved the great orator Cicero, who had opposed Antony in a series of speeches known as the Philippics. When Cicero was captured and executed, his head and hands were brought to Rome as proof of his death. Fulvia took possession of these grisly trophies and subjected them to tortures that shocked even Rome's battle-hardened veterans. She pulled out the tongue that had spoken against her husband and pierced it repeatedly with her hairpins, laughing with delight as she defiled the remains of one of Rome's greatest minds. But Fulvia's appetite for violence could not be satisfied through proxy executions alone. She craved direct involvement in warfare, the opportunity to command armies and witness mass slaughter firsthand. When political tensions with Octavian erupted into open conflict, Fulvia saw her chance to become not just the power behind the throne but a general in her own right. The Perusian War that followed was unlike any conflict in Roman history, largely because it was orchestrated by a woman whose understanding of warfare was filtered through a lens of pure sadism. Fulvia did not seek victory through strategic brilliance or tactical innovation. Instead, she pursued a campaign of deliberate atrocity designed to maximize suffering on both sides. She ordered the execution of prisoners not because they posed a threat, but because she enjoyed watching them die. She had cities burned not for military advantage, but for the pleasure of seeing the flames consume everything her enemies had built. In the annals of Roman history, few figures embody the complete corruption of power quite like Julia the Elder, the daughter of Augustus, who transformed from the empire's greatest hope into its most shameful disgrace. Born to be the living symbol of Rome's moral renewal, Julia instead became a walking testament to the depths of depravity that absolute privilege could reach. Her story is not merely one of personal excess, but of a woman who deliberately set out to destroy everything her father had built, using her own body and soul as weapons of mass moral destruction. Augustus had envisioned his daughter as the cornerstone of his cultural revolution, the embodiment of the traditional Roman virtues he sought to restore through his Julian laws. These laws promoted marriage, childbearing, and sexual morality, positioning the imperial family as the moral exemplar for all citizens to follow. Julia was to be the perfect Roman woman, chaste, devoted, fertile, and above all obedient to the will of her father and the needs of the state. Instead, she became the perfect weapon for destroying those very ideals from within. From her earliest youth, Julia showed signs of the monstrous entitlement that would define her adult life. She was not merely spoiled, she was systematically taught that her desires superseded all moral law, that her pleasure was more important than the welfare of others, and that her imperial blood granted her license to commit acts that would have resulted in execution for any ordinary citizen. Augustus, blinded by paternal love and political necessity, failed to recognize that he was nurturing a creature who would one day use his own laws against him in the most humiliating way possible. Julia's marriages were arranged for political reasons, each union designed to strengthen Augustus's dynasty and secure the succession. But rather than accepting these arrangements with the dutiful resignation expected of a Roman daughter, Julia used each marriage as an opportunity to perfect her skills in betrayal and cruelty. Her first husband, Marcellus, died young under mysterious circumstances that some attributed to poison. Her second marriage to Marcus Agrippa produced children, but also provided Julia with her first real taste of the power that sexual manipulation could wield over even the most virtuous men. It was during her final marriage to Tiberius that Julia's true nature fully emerged. Tiberius was a serious, disciplined man who took his responsibilities seriously and expected the same from his wife. Julia found his moral integrity insufferable and set about destroying it with systematic precision. She did not merely commit adultery, she transformed it into a public art form, conducting her affairs in the most visible and humiliating ways possible. Julia's lovers were not chosen for passion or even pleasure, but for the maximum damage their identities could inflict upon her father's reputation. She seduced senators who were supposed to be enforcing Augustus's moral laws, turning them into hypocrites and blackmail victims. She took gladiators and actors as lovers, deliberately choosing men from the lowest social classes to demonstrate her contempt for Roman social hierarchy. Most shocking of all, she conducted many of these affairs in public spaces, including the very forum where her father's laws were proclaimed. The most notorious of Julia's public displays occurred on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum where Augustus himself had announced his moral legislation. Julia chose this sacred space for an orgy that lasted through the night, coupling with multiple partners while drunk citizens watched and cheered. When news of this desecration reached Augustus, witnesses reported that the emperor wept openly, not just from personal humiliation but from the recognition that his own daughter had deliberately chosen to defile the most sacred symbols of his reign. But Julia's cruelty extended far beyond mere sexual exhibitionism. She used her affairs to destroy the lives of innocent people, seducing married men and then ensuring that their wives discovered the betrayals in the most painful ways possible. She would invite these women to dinner parties where she would flaunt her conquests, describing intimate details of their husbands' infidelities while forcing them to maintain the facade of social politeness. The psychological torture she inflicted on these victims provided her with a satisfaction that mere physical pleasure could never match. Julia also weaponized her children, using them as tools in her campaign of moral terrorism. She deliberately exposed them to her debauchery, forcing them to witness acts that no child should see and teaching them that traditional values were for the weak and stupid. She corrupted their tutors and servants, creating an environment of moral chaos that ensured the next generation of the imperial family would be as twisted as she was herself. Perhaps most damaging of all was Julia's systematic recruitment of other noble women into her circle of depravity. She did not content herself with her own corruption but actively worked to spread moral decay throughout the highest levels of Roman society. She hosted parties where aristocratic wives were encouraged to abandon their virtue, providing them with aphrodisiacs and introducing them to partners chosen specifically for their ability to corrupt and compromise. Many of these women, once respectable matrons, became willing participants in Julia's campaign of social destruction. The conspiracy that finally brought Julia down was not merely about adultery, but about treason in its most fundamental form. She had gathered around herself a group of men who were united not by love for her but by their shared hatred of Augustus and everything he represented. Using her body as bait and her position as leverage, Julia had created what amounted to a shadow government of disaffected nobles who dreamed of overthrowing the Principate and returning to the chaos of the late Republic. When Augustus finally acted against his daughter, it was not just a father punishing a wayward child, but an emperor defending the very foundation of his rule. Julia's exile to the barren island of Pandateria was intended not merely as punishment but as symbolic purification, removing the source of moral contamination from the heart of the empire. Yet even in exile, Julia continued her campaign of destruction, finding ways to corrupt her guards and servants, ensuring that her evil influence would continue to spread even from her island prison. The ultimate tragedy of Julia the Elder was not that she destroyed herself, but that she deliberately chose to become the antithesis of everything noble and virtuous in Roman civilization. transforming her privileged position into a platform for moral terrorism that would poison the empire for generations to come. In the twisted genealogy of Roman imperial evil, few betrayals cut as deeply as those committed by Livilla, the sister of Emperor Claudius and a woman who elevated familial treachery to an art form that would shock even the most callous observers of palace intrigue. Born into the heart of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Livilla possessed every advantage that noble blood could provide, yet she chose to use these gifts not to honor her family's legacy, but to systematically destroy it from within, leaving a trail of murdered relatives and broken trust that would haunt the imperial house for generations. Livilla was blessed with intelligence, beauty, and political connections that should have guaranteed her a life of honor and influence. As the daughter of Antonia Minor and the sister of the future Emperor Claudius, she occupied one of the most privileged positions in Roman society. Yet from her earliest years, Livilla demonstrated a cruel contempt for those around her that revealed the darkness lurking beneath her aristocratic facade. She openly mocked her brother Claudius for his physical disabilities, turning his stammer and limp into sources of public humiliation that would poison their relationship forever. Her marriage to Drusus the Younger, son of Emperor Tiberius, should have been the foundation of a powerful political alliance that strengthened the imperial family. Instead, Livilla transformed it into the perfect cover for one of the most audacious assassination plots in Roman history. Drusus was everything a Roman prince should be: brave, honorable, popular with both the army and the people. His only flaw was that he stood in the way of Livilla's insatiable ambition and her growing obsession with Sejanus, the ruthless commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was a man of humble origins who had clawed his way to power through a combination of cunning, brutality, and an absolute lack of moral restraint. Under Tiberius, he had become the second most powerful man in Rome, controlling access to the emperor and gradually isolating him from his advisors and family. Livilla recognized in Sejanus a kindred spirit, someone whose appetite for power matched her own, and whose willingness to commit any crime necessary to achieve his goals aligned perfectly with her own moral void. Their affair was not merely a matter of passion, but a calculated partnership in evil that would culminate in one of the most heinous crimes in imperial history. Together they plotted the murder of Drusus, not through the quick death of a blade or the sudden violence of assassination, but through the slow agony of poison administered over months with methodical precision. Livilla, with access to her husband's food and drink, became the instrument of his destruction, feeding him death in small doses while playing the role of devoted wife and concerned caretaker. The poison they chose was particularly cruel, designed not just to kill but to cause maximum suffering while maintaining the appearance of natural illness. Drusus began to waste away slowly, his strength ebbing as mysterious symptoms racked his body. He suffered from violent stomach pains, sudden fevers, and periods of delirium that left him helpless and confused. Throughout his ordeal, Livilla remained at his bedside, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort while secretly calculating the next dose that would bring him closer to death. As Drusus lay dying, Livilla's performance of grief was a masterpiece of deception that fooled even the most suspicious observers. She wept convincingly at his bedside, called in the best physicians to treat his mysterious illness, and appeared to spare no expense in trying to save his life. When he finally succumbed to the poison, she collapsed in apparent anguish, her cries of sorrow echoing through the palace while inside she celebrated the success of her plan. With Drusus dead, Livilla and Sejanus believed they had cleared the path to ultimate power. Sejanus would marry into the imperial family through his union with Livilla, legitimizing his position and bringing him one step closer to the throne itself. But their conspiracy required the elimination of more obstacles, including Tiberius himself and any other family members who might challenge their authority. The hubris that drove Livilla to murder her own husband ultimately led to her downfall. Sejanus's former wife, Apicata, driven by jealousy and rage over her abandonment, revealed the truth about Drusus's death in a letter to Tiberius. The emperor, finally awakening to the scale of the betrayal that had occurred under his own roof, moved swiftly to destroy the conspirators who had murdered his son and threatened his dynasty. Sejanus was arrested and executed, but Livilla's punishment was far more personal and devastating. Tiberius ordered that she be turned over to her own mother, Antonia Minor, for justice. Antonia, a woman renowned for her virtue and honor, was faced with the horrific reality that she had given birth to a monster who had murdered her own grandson and betrayed everything the family represented. The justice that Antonia imposed was both terrible and fitting. She locked Livilla in a room in their family home and refused to allow her any food or water. Day after day, Antonia stood outside that locked door, listening to her daughter's pleas for mercy, while steeling herself to see justice done. Livilla, who had shown no mercy to her husband as she slowly poisoned him to death, was left to experience the same gradual destruction she had inflicted on others. The irony of Livilla's death was not lost on those who knew the full story of her crimes. The woman who had used her position as a loving wife to commit murder was ultimately destroyed by a mother's love for justice, executed by the very family bonds she had so callously betrayed. While not Roman by birth, Cleopatra VII Philopator earned her place among history's most destructive women through her systematic campaign to corrupt and ultimately destroy the very foundations of Roman civilization. She was not merely a foreign queen seeking to preserve her kingdom, but a calculating predator who recognized that Rome's greatest weakness lay in the ambitions and appetites of its most powerful men. Using her legendary beauty and cunning as weapons of mass political destruction, Cleopatra succeeded in bringing the Roman Republic to its knees and plunging the Mediterranean world into decades of civil war that would cost millions of lives. Cleopatra's rise to power had been stained with blood from the very beginning, establishing a pattern of familial murder that would define her entire reign. When she and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII inherited joint rule of Egypt, the arrangement lasted barely 3 years before Cleopatra orchestrated his assassination, drowning him in the Nile while he still trusted her as his sister and co-ruler. This was not merely political necessity, but a demonstration of the cold-blooded ruthlessness that would characterize all her future relationships. She had learned early that family bonds meant nothing when power was at stake, and she would apply this lesson with devastating effectiveness to her Roman victims. Her first target was Julius Caesar, already married and committed to his duties as Rome's most powerful general. Cleopatra's seduction of Caesar was not a romantic affair but a calculated act of political warfare designed to corrupt one of Rome's greatest leaders and turn him into an instrument of Egyptian interests. She had herself smuggled to Caesar, wrapped in a carpet, an act that has been romanticized by historians but was actually a carefully planned psychological manipulation designed to appeal to his vanity and sense of adventure. Under Cleopatra's influence, Caesar abandoned his responsibilities to Rome and became obsessed with establishing a dynasty that would unite East and West under his rule. She bore him a son, Caesarion, not out of love but as a political weapon that could be used to legitimize her claims on Roman power. Through her manipulations, Caesar began to adopt the trappings of Eastern monarchy that horrified traditional Romans, appearing in public with symbols of divine kingship that violated every principle of republican government. The corruption of Caesar was only the beginning of Cleopatra's assault on Roman values. She transformed him from a disciplined military commander into a pleasure-seeking despot who spent months wallowing in luxury on the Nile, while his enemies gathered strength in Rome. The time Caesar wasted in Egypt, seduced by Cleopatra's promises of unlimited pleasure and power, allowed his political opponents to organize the conspiracy that would ultimately lead to his assassination. In effect, Cleopatra's seduction of Caesar was the first step in the chain of events that would destroy the Roman Republic. When Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March, Cleopatra showed her true nature by immediately beginning her hunt for a new Roman patron to corrupt and exploit. She set her sights on Mark Antony, a man whose weaknesses were even more pronounced than Caesar's, and whose corruption would prove far more devastating to Roman interests. Her seduction of Antony was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined sexual enticement with appeals to his grandiose fantasies of conquest and power. Cleopatra's famous arrival to meet Antony, dressed as Venus on a golden barge adorned with purple sails and silver oars, was not a romantic gesture but a calculated display of wealth and power designed to overwhelm his senses and cloud his judgment. She understood that Antony was a man driven by appetite rather than principle, and she fed those appetites with an endless stream of luxury, entertainment, and sexual gratification that gradually separated him from his Roman identity and responsibilities. Under Cleopatra's influence, Antony began to see himself not as a Roman general but as an Eastern potentate, adopting Egyptian customs and openly favoring Cleopatra's interests over those of Rome. She convinced him to divide the Eastern territories among their children, effectively creating a parallel empire that challenged Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean. This was not merely political alliance but a deliberate attempt to dismember the Roman Empire and replace it with a hybrid kingdom that would serve Egyptian interests. The children Cleopatra bore to Antony were not expressions of love but political weapons designed to create competing claims to Roman inheritance. She named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, invoking the memory of Alexander the Great and positioning them as the rightful heirs to both Roman and Macedonian legacies. Through these children, she hoped to create a dynasty that would ultimately subordinate Rome to Egyptian control, reversing centuries of Roman expansion and dominance. Cleopatra's corruption of Antony reached its peak when she convinced him to divorce his Roman wife Octavia, sister of Octavian, in favor of a marriage alliance with Egypt. This act was not merely personal betrayal but a declaration of war against Roman family values and political traditions. It provided Octavian with the perfect justification for rallying Roman opinion against Antony as a traitor who had abandoned his country for a foreign seductress. The final battle at Actium was the inevitable result of Cleopatra's decades-long campaign of corruption and manipulation. When defeat became certain, she revealed her ultimate cowardice by abandoning Antony in the middle of the battle, fleeing back to Egypt and leaving her lover to face destruction alone. This act of betrayal drove Antony to suicide and sealed the fate of the last independent Hellenistic kingdom. Among the gallery of imperial wives who corrupted Rome through manipulation and murder, Poppaea Sabina stands apart as perhaps the most calculating and ruthless of them all. Her legendary beauty was merely the weapon she wielded in a campaign of systematic destruction that would claim the lives of emperors, empresses, and countless innocent victims caught in her web of ambition. She transformed seduction into an art of political assassination, using her physical charms to orchestrate some of the most shocking murders in Roman history while maintaining the facade of an innocent victim of circumstance. Poppaea's path to infamy began with her first marriage to Rufrius Crispinus, a respectable Roman knight who provided her with social standing but insufficient power to satisfy her boundless ambitions. She quickly recognized that her extraordinary beauty could serve as a passport to far greater heights, and she set about systematically destroying her marriage while cultivating relationships with more powerful men. Her affair with Otho, a close friend of the future Emperor Nero, was not driven by passion but by cold calculation, as she recognized that Otho's connections could provide her with access to the imperial court. When Otho introduced her to Nero, Poppaea immediately recognized the opportunity that had been placed before her. The young emperor was already showing signs of the cruel instability that would define his reign, but he was also desperately insecure and hungry for validation from those he considered his social superiors. Poppaea understood that Nero's greatest weakness was his need to be admired and desired, and she crafted her approach to exploit this vulnerability with surgical precision. Her seduction of Nero was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined calculated availability with strategic rejection. She would appear at court functions dressed in ways that highlighted her legendary beauty, then retreat just as Nero's interest was fully aroused. She praised his artistic talents while subtly suggesting that his wife Octavia was too simple and virtuous to truly appreciate his sophisticated nature. Through carefully orchestrated encounters, she convinced Nero that she alone understood his true greatness and that their love was destined by the gods themselves. But Poppaea's ultimate goal was not merely to become Nero's mistress, but to replace Octavia as empress, a position that would require the elimination of one of Rome's most beloved figures. Octavia was the daughter of Emperor Claudius, sister to Britannicus, and a woman whose virtue and dignity had earned her the devotion of the Roman people. Her popularity represented a significant obstacle to Poppaea's ambitions, one that could only be overcome through a campaign of character assassination followed by actual murder. Poppaea began by poisoning Nero's mind against his wife, constantly suggesting that Octavia was disloyal, unfaithful, and unworthy of imperial honors. She fabricated evidence of adultery, bribed servants to provide false testimony, and gradually convinced Nero that his wife was plotting against him. When divorce alone proved insufficient to satisfy the Roman people's outrage, Poppaea pushed for more extreme measures, knowing that Octavia's continued existence would always represent a threat to her own position. The murder of Octavia was orchestrated with meticulous attention to detail that revealed the depths of Poppaea's cruelty. Rather than allowing the former empress a quick death, Poppaea insisted on methods that would maximize both physical and psychological suffering. Octavia was first exiled to a remote island, where she was tortured and humiliated before finally being executed. Her severed head was brought to Poppaea as proof that her rival had been eliminated, and witnesses reported that she examined it with satisfaction before ordering it displayed as a warning to other potential threats. With Octavia dead, Poppaea achieved her goal of becoming empress, but her appetite for destruction was far from satisfied. She recognized that Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, represented another obstacle to her complete dominance over the emperor. Agrippina had orchestrated Nero's rise to power and maintained significant influence over imperial policy, influence that Poppaea was determined to eliminate entirely. The campaign against Agrippina required even greater subtlety, as the former empress was far more dangerous than the innocent Octavia. Poppaea began by exploiting the natural tensions between Nero and his domineering mother, constantly suggesting that Agrippina was trying to control him and prevent him from achieving his true potential. She painted every instance of maternal advice as an attempt at manipulation, every expression of concern as evidence of disloyalty. When Agrippina attempted to maintain her influence by cultivating relationships with other members of the imperial family, Poppaea convinced Nero that his mother was plotting a coup. She provided him with fabricated evidence of treasonous meetings and encouraged his paranoid fantasies about maternal betrayal. Through her manipulation, she transformed the natural friction between mother and son into a deadly conspiracy that would culminate in one of the most shocking murders in Roman history. The assassination of Agrippina was carried out with methods so elaborate and cruel that they bore Poppy's unmistakable signature. Rather than a simple poisoning or stabbing, Nero attempted to kill his mother through a collapsing boat designed to appear as an accident. When Agrippina survived this initial attempt by swimming to shore, Poppy insisted on more direct action, ultimately convincing Nero to send assassins who murdered his mother in her own villa. Through these calculated murders, Poppy had achieved unprecedented power over the Roman Empire, ruling through an emperor who had become completely dependent on her approval and guidance. She had eliminated every rival and obstacle, transforming herself from a provincial beauty into the most powerful woman in the ancient world. In the pantheon of Roman empresses whose corruption stained the imperial purple, few betrayals cut as deeply as those committed by Faustina the Younger, the wife of the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. While her husband spent his days contemplating virtue and composing meditations on duty and honor, Faustina was systematically destroying everything he represented through a campaign of sexual depravity and political treachery that would ultimately contribute to the empire's moral collapse. Her story represents perhaps the most tragic contradiction in Roman history, the corruption of goodness by evil wearing the mask of beauty and refinement. Marcus Aurelius was everything a Roman emperor should be: wise, disciplined, devoted to the welfare of his people and the preservation of imperial virtue. His philosophical writings would inspire generations of leaders, and his reign represented the last golden age of Roman civilization. Yet this paragon of virtue was married to a woman whose appetites and ambitions were so fundamentally corrupt that she would spend their entire marriage working to undermine everything he tried to accomplish, using her position as empress to spread moral decay throughout the highest levels of Roman society. Faustina's corruption was not born of ignorance or circumstance, but of a deliberate choice to embrace evil as a source of personal pleasure and political power. From the earliest days of her marriage, she demonstrated a complete contempt for the philosophical principles that guided her husband's life, viewing his commitment to virtue as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be admired. Where Marcus Aurelius saw duty, Faustina saw opportunity. Where he saw moral obligation, she saw obstacles to be circumvented through deception and manipulation. Her affairs were not merely expressions of sexual appetite, but calculated acts of political warfare designed to compromise and control the men who served in her husband's administration. She targeted senators, generals, and provincial governors with systematic precision, using her legendary beauty and imperial position to seduce them into relationships that left them vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation. Each affair was carefully chosen for its potential to advance her hidden agenda of accumulating personal power while undermining her husband's authority. The most shocking aspect of Faustina's betrayals was not their scope, but their sadistic creativity. She took particular pleasure in corrupting men who had previously been known for their virtue and integrity, transforming respected public servants into accomplices in her schemes of moral destruction. She would identify the weaknesses of her targets through careful observation, then exploit those vulnerabilities with techniques that revealed a profound understanding of human psychology and an absolute absence of empathy or moral restraint. Her affair with Avidius Cassius, the powerful general who governed the eastern provinces, represented the pinnacle of her treachery and the most dangerous threat to imperial stability during Marcus Aurelius's reign. Cassius was everything that attracted Faustina: ambitious, ruthless, and possessed of the military power necessary to challenge imperial authority. Their relationship was not merely adultery but active treason, as Faustina began feeding Cassius information about imperial policy while encouraging his growing ambitions for the throne itself. The conspiracy that emerged from this relationship would nearly destroy the empire that Marcus Aurelius had spent his life trying to perfect. Faustina convinced Cassius that her husband was weak and ineffective, that the eastern provinces deserved a stronger leader, and that the Roman people would welcome a military strongman who could restore the empire's former glory. She provided him with detailed intelligence about imperial military dispositions, financial resources, and political vulnerabilities that enabled him to plan a rebellion with unprecedented precision and scope. When false reports of Marcus Aurelius's death reached the eastern provinces, Faustina seized the opportunity to activate the conspiracy she had been nurturing for years. She sent secret communications to Cassius encouraging him to declare himself emperor, promising him the support of sympathetic elements within the imperial court, and guaranteeing that she would use her influence to smooth his path to power. The revolt that followed plunged the empire into civil war and forced Marcus Aurelius to abandon his philosophical studies for the brutal necessities of military campaign. The psychological torture that Faustina inflicted on her husband through this betrayal was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her campaign of destruction. Marcus Aurelius was a man who genuinely believed in the power of love and virtue to transform human nature, and he had spent their entire marriage trying to inspire Faustina to embrace the philosophical principles that guided his own life. To discover that she had not only rejected his teachings but actively worked to destroy everything he had built represented a personal catastrophe that shattered his faith in the possibility of human goodness. Even after the rebellion was crushed and Cassius was dead, Faustina continued her campaign of moral terrorism through more subtle means. She established a network of informants and agents throughout the imperial bureaucracy, using sexual favors and financial incentives to corrupt officials and gather intelligence that she could use for future conspiracies. She systematically undermined her husband's appointees, spreading rumors and accusations designed to destroy reputations and create an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia within the imperial court. Perhaps most damaging of all was Faustina's corruption of her own children, particularly her son Commodus, who would eventually inherit the throne. Rather than teaching him the philosophical principles that had made his father a great emperor, Faustina encouraged his worst impulses, nurturing the cruelty and self-indulgence that would transform him into one of history's most despised tyrants. Through her influence, she ensured that the Antonine dynasty's commitment to virtue would die with Marcus Aurelius, replaced by the moral chaos that would characterize the empire's decline. In the annals of Byzantine history, no figure represents the complete inversion of imperial dignity, quite like Empress Theodora, the former actress and courtesan, who clawed her way from the gutter to the throne through a combination of sexual manipulation, ruthless ambition, and an absolute contempt for the moral foundations of civilized society. While later historians would attempt to rehabilitate her reputation by focusing on her legal reforms and political acumen, the truth remains that Theodora's rise to power represented one of the most shocking reversals of social order in history, transforming the sacred office of empress into a platform for the systematic corruption of an entire civilization. Theodora's origins in the lowest depths of Constantinople's entertainment industry were not merely humble beginnings to be overcome, but formative experiences that shaped her into a creature fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of imperial rule. As an actress in an age when the profession was synonymous with prostitution, she had learned to view her body as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, and her sexuality as a weapon to be deployed against anyone who possessed something she desired. These lessons in exploitation and manipulation would serve as the foundation for her eventual conquest of the Byzantine Empire itself. The stories of Theodora's early career that were recorded by contemporary historians paint a picture of depravity so extreme that it challenged the boundaries of what civilized society could tolerate. She performed in theatrical productions that were little more than public displays of sexual exhibition, taking roles that required her to engage in acts that shocked even Constantinople's jaded audiences. Her performances were not merely entertainment, but deliberate assaults on public decency designed to normalize behaviors that had previously been confined to the darkest corners of urban vice. But Theodora's ambitions extended far beyond mere sexual exhibition. She recognized that her unconventional beauty and complete lack of moral restraint could serve as tools for political advancement if properly deployed. She began cultivating relationships with wealthy and powerful men, not as a common prostitute seeking payment for services rendered, but as a calculating predator seeking to accumulate the resources and connections necessary for her ultimate goal of ascending to the highest levels of imperial society. Her seduction of Justinian, the future emperor, was not a romantic fairy tale of love conquering social barriers, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological manipulation that transformed one of history's greatest rulers into the unwitting instrument of his own empire's moral destruction. Justinian was a man of genuine piety and administrative brilliance who had dedicated his life to the restoration of Roman imperial glory and the codification of legal principles that would endure for centuries. Theodora recognized that his greatest weakness was his isolation from normal human relationships and his desperate hunger for emotional connection. She crafted her approach to Justinian with the precision of a military strategist, alternating between passionate devotion and calculated distance in ways designed to create an emotional dependency that would override his rational judgment. She presented herself not as the debased actress she had been, but as a reformed woman seeking redemption through his love, appealing to his Christian beliefs about forgiveness and transformation while carefully concealing the depths of corruption that no amount of imperial power could truly cleanse. The legal obstacles to their marriage, including laws that specifically prohibited senators from marrying actresses, were not barriers to be respected but challenges to be overcome through the systematic corruption of imperial institutions. Theodora convinced Justinian to change the fundamental laws of the empire to accommodate their union, setting a precedent that personal desire could override centuries of legal tradition and social custom. This was not merely a romantic gesture, but the first step in the complete subordination of imperial law to Theodora's will. Once established as empress, Theodora began the systematic transformation of the Byzantine court from a center of imperial dignity into a reflection of her own corrupt values. She surrounded herself with former associates from her theatrical career, elevating prostitutes, pimps, and other denizens of Constantinople's underworld to positions of influence and authority. The palace that had once been the sacred center of Roman imperial tradition became a haven for the very people whom traditional society had rightfully excluded from positions of responsibility. Her influence over imperial policy was not limited to personnel appointments but extended to the fundamental character of Byzantine governance itself. She encouraged the use of sexual blackmail as a tool of statecraft, maintaining detailed files on the private vices of senators, generals, and provincial governors that could be used to ensure their compliance with her wishes. The imperial court became a place where advancement depended not on merit or virtue but on willingness to participate in or tolerate the moral degradation that Theodora represented. Perhaps most damaging of all was Theodora's systematic destruction of the traditional Roman concept of imperial dignity. Previous empresses had understood that their elevated position required them to serve as moral exemplars for the empire's citizens, embodying the virtues of chastity, piety, and devotion to the common good. Theodora inverted these expectations entirely, using her position to legitimize behaviors that had previously been considered incompatible with civilized society. The religious policies that emerged during her reign reflected this fundamental corruption of imperial values. While Justinian genuinely sought to strengthen Christian orthodoxy and eliminate heretical beliefs, Theodora manipulated these efforts to serve her own agenda of social revolution. In the twilight of Rome's Severan dynasty, when the empire teetered on the brink of the chaos that would consume the 3rd century, there emerged a woman whose suffocating control and paranoid jealousy would extinguish the final flickering flame of imperial stability. Julia Marmonier, mother of Emperor Severus Alexander, represented the ultimate corruption of maternal influence, transforming what should have been protective guidance into a tyrannical domination that would ultimately trigger the collapse of organized government and plunge Rome into 50 years of civil war, barbarian invasion, and economic devastation. Marmonier was the product of the Syrian women who had dominated imperial politics for decades, inheriting from her predecessors not their intelligence and political acumen but their worst qualities of ruthless ambition and moral flexibility. As the daughter of Julia Maesa and sister of Julia Soennes, she had witnessed firsthand the rise and fall of the boy emperor Elagabalus, learning valuable lessons about the dangers of allowing young rulers too much independence. When her own son ascended to the throne at the age of 13, Marmonier was determined to avoid the mistakes that had led to her nephew's assassination, but her methods would prove far more destructive than the chaos she sought to prevent. From the moment Severus Alexander became emperor, Marmonier established a system of control so comprehensive and stifling that it effectively eliminated any possibility of effective imperial governance. She did not merely advise her son or influence his decisions, she replaced him entirely as the functional ruler of the empire while maintaining the fiction that he held ultimate authority. Every appointment, every policy decision, every military command had to receive her explicit approval, creating a bureaucratic bottleneck that paralyzed the imperial administration at precisely the moment when decisive action was most desperately needed. Marmonier's paranoid jealousy extended to every aspect of her son's life, personal as well as political. She could not tolerate the possibility that anyone else might gain influence over Alexander, viewing every friendship, every professional relationship, every expression of independent thought as a threat to her own position. When Alexander married, Marmonier systematically destroyed his relationship with his wife through a campaign of psychological warfare that ultimately drove the young woman away, leaving the emperor isolated and emotionally dependent on his mother's approval for even the most basic human connections. The military crises that defined Alexander's reign required bold leadership and the ability to inspire confidence in both soldiers and officers. Instead, Marmonier's interference created a command structure so dysfunctional that it undermined Roman military effectiveness at every level. She insisted on personally approving all military appointments, selecting commanders not for their competence or experience but for their willingness to submit to her authority. The result was a series of military disasters that cost the empire territory, resources, and prestige, while barbarian tribes grew increasingly bold in their attacks on Roman frontiers. Perhaps most damaging of all was Marmonier's systematic destruction of the imperial financial system through her insatiable greed and complete ignorance of economic principles. She treated the imperial treasury as her personal possession, directing vast sums toward unnecessary construction projects and lavish displays designed to enhance her own reputation rather than addressing the empire's pressing military and administrative needs. Her financial mismanagement created the inflation and currency debasement that would plague Rome for generations, transforming what had been a prosperous and stable economy into a source of popular discontent and political instability. The corruption that Mamaea introduced into imperial governance extended far beyond mere incompetence to encompass a fundamental betrayal of the principles that had made Roman administration the marvel of the ancient world. She sold government positions to the highest bidders, appointed unqualified favorites to crucial posts, and allowed the systematic looting of provincial treasuries by officials who understood that their tenure depended on their ability to satisfy her financial demands rather than serve the public good. When barbarian invasions and internal rebellions finally forced Alexander to take the field personally, Mamaea's continued interference proved catastrophic. She accompanied the army on campaign, creating a dual command structure that confused orders, delayed responses, and undermined military discipline. Soldiers who should have been focused on defending the empire found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties, uncertain whether to obey their emperor or his mother when their commands contradicted each other. The final crisis came when Mamaea's attempts to negotiate with Germanic tribes rather than fight them convinced the army that both she and Alexander were cowards unworthy of imperial authority. Her preference for diplomatic solutions over military action might have been defensible under other circumstances, but in the context of barbarian invasions threatening the very existence of Roman civilization, it appeared to be evidence of weakness that no self-respecting soldier could accept. The mutiny that claimed both their lives in 235 AD was not merely a military coup but a desperate attempt by the Roman army to save itself from leaders whose incompetence threatened the survival of the empire itself. When the soldiers murdered Alexander and Mamaea in their tent, they were not just eliminating failed rulers but symbolically rejecting the entire system of maternal domination that had paralyzed imperial governance for more than a decade. The 50 years of chaos that followed their deaths, known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, can be traced directly to the institutional damage that Mamaea's misrule had inflicted on the empire. Her systematic destruction of military effectiveness, financial stability, and administrative competence created a vacuum of authority that ambitious generals rushed to fill, leading to the civil wars and foreign invasions that nearly destroyed Roman civilization entirely. Julia Mamaea's legacy stands as perhaps the most powerful argument against the concentration of political power in the hands of those who mistake personal control for effective governance, demonstrating how maternal love, when corrupted by ambition and paranoia, can become the most destructive force in human history. In the blood-soaked chronicles of Rome's decline, few figures embody the complete abandonment of imperial responsibility quite like Julia Soaemias, the mother who elevated her teenage son to the throne and then encouraged him to transform the empire into a stage for his deranged fantasies of divine incarnation and sexual perversion. Her reign as the power behind Emperor Elagabalus represents one of the most catastrophic failures of judgment in human history, as a woman who possessed the intelligence and resources to guide Rome toward stability instead chose to enable the systematic destruction of everything that had made Roman civilization great. Soaemias was the product of the Syrian royal house that had infiltrated Roman politics through marriage and manipulation, inheriting from her ancestors a dangerous combination of Eastern mysticism and Western political ambition that would prove toxic when applied to imperial governance. When her mother Julia Mamaea orchestrated the rebellion that placed 14-year-old Elagabalus on the throne, Soaemias saw an opportunity to achieve unprecedented power through her son's elevation, but she fatally underestimated the depths of corruption and madness that lurked beneath his youthful exterior. From the moment Elagabalus became emperor, Soaemias made the catastrophic decision to encourage rather than restrain his most dangerous impulses, apparently believing that his shocking behavior would somehow strengthen their hold on power by eliminating conventional opposition. When he announced his intention to replace Jupiter with the Syrian sun god Elagabal as the supreme deity of Rome, Soaemias not only supported this religious revolution but actively participated in its implementation, helping to design ceremonies that scandalized even the most tolerant observers of imperial excess. The religious practices that Soaemias enabled were not merely different from traditional Roman worship but actively designed to assault the moral foundations of imperial society. She watched approvingly as her son performed ritual castrations, engaged in public homosexual acts as part of religious ceremonies, and forced the most distinguished senators in Rome to participate in degrading performances that violated every principle of Roman dignity. Rather than recognizing these actions as symptoms of mental illness requiring intervention, Soaemias treated them as expressions of divine inspiration deserving of celebration and support. Her role in facilitating Elagabalus's sexual crimes represents perhaps the most shocking aspect of her maternal malpractice. When her teenage son began demanding that physicians perform surgery to transform him physically into a woman, Soaemias encouraged these procedures rather than seeking treatment for what was clearly a severe psychological disorder. She supported his multiple marriages to both men and women, often in elaborate ceremonies that mocked traditional Roman marriage customs while promoting sexual practices that horrified the empire's citizens. The political consequences of Soaemias's enabling behavior extended far beyond mere scandal to encompass the systematic destruction of imperial administrative effectiveness. She allowed Elagabalus to appoint lovers and random favorites to crucial government positions, creating a bureaucracy so incompetent and corrupt that basic functions of imperial governance began to break down. Provincial administration collapsed as unqualified appointees looted treasuries and ignored their responsibilities, while military commands were distributed based on sexual attractiveness rather than tactical competence. Perhaps most damaging of all was Soaemias's failure to recognize that her son's behavior was alienating the very military forces upon which their power depended. Roman soldiers had reluctantly accepted foreign emperors and even tolerated moderate degrees of imperial excess, but Elagabalus's open contempt for traditional masculine virtues and his deliberate feminization of the imperial image violated fundamental military values that no amount of gold or political manipulation could overcome. When reports reached the frontier legions of their emperor dancing in women's clothing while performing religious rituals dedicated to foreign gods, Soaemias apparently failed to understand that she had created a crisis of military confidence that threatened the survival of the dynasty itself. Instead of moderating her son's behavior or seeking ways to repair the damage to imperial prestige, she doubled down on supporting his increasingly extreme actions, apparently believing that shock value alone could substitute for effective leadership. The conspiracy that ultimately destroyed both Elagabalus and Soaemias was orchestrated by her own mother, Julia Maiaza, who finally recognized that their behavior had become an existential threat to the family's political survival. When Maiaza began promoting Soaemias' nephew Severus Alexander as an alternative emperor, Soaemias responded not with accommodation but with increased defiance, apparently believing that her control over Elagabalus gave her sufficient power to overcome any challenge to their authority. The final confrontation between mother and son occurred when the Praetorian Guard, disgusted by 4 years of increasing degeneracy and administrative chaos, finally decided that enough was enough. When they stormed the palace in 222 AD, Soaemias died defending a son whose reign had become synonymous with everything that was wrong with imperial government, her last act a fitting symbol of the misguided loyalty that had enabled so much destruction. The brutal manner of their deaths, dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River like common criminals, reflected the depth of popular hatred that Soaemias's enabling had created. She had possessed the power to guide her son toward responsible leadership, but had instead chosen to facilitate his transformation into a monster whose very existence threatened the foundations of civilized society. Julia Soaemias's legacy serves as a permanent warning about the catastrophic consequences that can result when maternal love becomes confused with enabling behavior, demonstrating how the failure to set appropriate boundaries can transform family affection into a force of social destruction. In the darkest corridors of imperial manipulation, where family bonds became weapons and maternal instincts were perverted into instruments of political warfare, there stalked a woman whose capacity for cold-blooded calculation would make even the most hardened observers of Roman cruelty recoil in horror. Julia Maeza was not content to destroy individual lives or even single dynasties, but instead orchestrated a campaign of systematic chaos that would claim multiple emperors, devastate the imperial succession, and ultimately contribute to the collapse of the very political system that had elevated her family to unprecedented heights of power and influence. Maeza's ascent to the pinnacle of imperial politics had been built upon the corpses of previous rulers and the systematic exploitation of military discontent with the existing order. When Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD, she found herself and her family exiled from court by the new ruler Macrinus, a man whose humble origins and lack of dynastic connections made him vulnerable to the kind of sophisticated political warfare in which the Syrian women of her family had become expert practitioners through generations of experience. Rather than accepting exile as a permanent condition or seeking accommodation with the new regime, Maeza immediately began plotting a rebellion that would restore her family to power through methods so ruthless and cynical that they would shock even Rome's jaded political establishment. She recognized that Macrinus's greatest weakness lay in his lack of legitimacy among the Eastern legions, soldiers who had served under the Severan dynasty and could potentially be convinced to support a restoration if presented with a credible alternative candidate. The candidate Maeza selected for this role was her 14-year-old grandson Elagabalus, a choice that revealed the depths of her moral corruption and her willingness to sacrifice innocent lives in pursuit of political advantage. She knew that placing a child on the throne would create opportunities for behind-the-scenes manipulation while providing her with a malleable figurehead who could be controlled and directed according to her own political agenda, regardless of the psychological damage such exploitation might inflict upon the boy himself. The rebellion that Maeza orchestrated was not merely a military coup but a carefully crafted campaign of deception that relied upon fabricated genealogies, forged documents, and systematically spread lies about Elagabalus's true parentage. She claimed that her grandson was the illegitimate son of Caracalla, a story that had no basis in fact but provided the necessary dynastic justification for his claim to imperial power. The ease with which she manufactured this false narrative demonstrated her complete contempt for truth and her willingness to base an entire political movement upon deliberate lies. When the Eastern legions declared for Elagabalus and began their march toward Rome, Maeza revealed another aspect of her character that would prove even more destructive than her capacity for political manipulation. She began systematically corrupting her grandson, encouraging behaviors and attitudes that would transform him from an innocent child into the depraved monster whose reign would become synonymous with imperial degeneracy and administrative collapse. Rather than providing the guidance and moral instruction that a 14-year-old emperor desperately needed, Maeza actively encouraged Elagabalus to indulge his worst impulses, apparently believing that his shocking behavior would somehow strengthen their hold on power by eliminating conventional opposition. She supported his religious innovations not because she shared his theological convictions, but because she recognized that religious controversy could be used as a tool for political control, dividing potential opponents and creating opportunities for manipulation. The 4 years of chaos that followed Elagabalus's elevation to the throne were not merely the result of a mentally unstable emperor, but the direct consequence of Maya's deliberate policy of enabling and encouraging his most destructive behaviors. She watched approvingly as he destroyed the dignity of imperial office, corrupted the administrative system, and alienated the military forces upon which their power depended, apparently believing that short-term political advantage justified any amount of long-term institutional damage. When it became clear that Elagabalus's reign had become an existential threat to the dynasty's survival, Mayasa demonstrated the cold-blooded ruthlessness that had characterized her entire political career by orchestrating the assassination of her own grandson. She did not merely abandon him to his fate, but actively participated in planning his murder, providing intelligence to his enemies and helping to coordinate the conspiracy that would claim both his life and that of his mother, Julia Soaemias. The method Mayasa chose for eliminating Elagabalus revealed the depths of her calculating cruelty. Rather than arranging for a quick assassination that might have preserved some dignity for the imperial office, she encouraged a prolonged campaign of humiliation and degradation designed to strip away every vestige of imperial authority before the final blow was struck. She helped spread rumors about his mental instability, provided evidence of his most shocking behaviors to potential conspirators, and systematically undermined his support base among the Praetorian Guard. When the moment for action finally arrived, Masa's betrayal was complete and devastating. She personally delivered the intelligence that allowed the assassins to locate Elagabalus and Soaemias in their hiding place, ensuring that both would be captured and killed in the most brutal manner possible. The fact that one of the victims was her own daughter apparently caused her no hesitation, as she had long since learned to subordinate family loyalty to political necessity in her relentless pursuit of power. With Elagabalus and Soaemias dead, Maysa immediately moved to install her other grandson, Severus Alexander, as emperor, apparently believing that she could control this new puppet more effectively than she had managed his predecessor. But her manipulation of Alexander would prove even more destructive than her corruption of Elagabalus, as she systematically destroyed his capacity for independent judgment, while placing him in situations that required decisive leadership and personal courage. The 13-year reign of Severus Alexander under Masa's guidance represented the final collapse of effective imperial governance, as she created a system so dysfunctional that it became incapable of addressing the mounting crises that threatened the empire's survival. She insisted on maintaining direct control over all major decisions while simultaneously ensuring that Alexander received the blame for every failure, creating a situation where responsibility was divorced from authority in ways that made effective leadership impossible. Masa's destruction of the imperial succession system extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted upon individual emperors to encompass a fundamental corruption of the principles that had made Roman government effective for centuries. By demonstrating that imperial power could be achieved through deception, manipulation, and murder rather than merit or popular support, she established precedents that would be followed by countless ambitious individuals seeking to exploit the empire's weaknesses for personal gain. The military disasters that characterized Alexander's reign were the direct result of Masa's interference in command decisions and her systematic appointment of unqualified officers based on their personal loyalty rather than their professional competence. When barbarian invasions threatened the frontier provinces, the Roman response was paralyzed by a command structure so corrupted by political considerations that basic military effectiveness became impossible to achieve. The economic collapse that accompanied these military failures reflected Mace's complete ignorance of fiscal responsibility and her treatment of the imperial treasury as a source of personal enrichment rather than a tool for effective governance. She diverted resources away from essential military and administrative functions toward unnecessary construction projects and lavish displays designed to enhance her own reputation, creating the financial instability that would plague the empire for generations. Perhaps most tragically, Mace's systematic destruction of imperial dignity and effectiveness came at precisely the moment when strong leadership was most desperately needed. The 3rd century crisis that would nearly destroy Roman civilization was already beginning to emerge during Alexander's reign, requiring decisive action and competent administration to address the mounting challenges of barbarian invasion, internal rebellion, and economic disruption. Instead of providing the leadership that these crises demanded, Mace's manipulation ensured that the empire entered its greatest trial period with institutions so weakened and corrupted that they would prove incapable of mounting an effective response. The 50 years of chaos that followed Alexander's assassination can be traced directly to the institutional damage that her misrule had inflicted upon the foundations of imperial government. When Mace finally died, apparently from natural causes sometime during Alexander's reign, she left behind a legacy of destruction so comprehensive that it would require decades of painful reconstruction to repair even a fraction of the damage she had caused. Her life stands as perhaps the most powerful demonstration in human history of how individual ambition, when unconstrained by moral principle or genuine concern for the common good, can become a force of destruction capable of bringing down entire civilizations. In the blood-stained chronicles of imperial Rome, where mothers were expected to guide their children toward virtue and wisdom, there emerged a woman whose intellectual brilliance and philosophical pretensions masked a heart so corrupted by ambition that she would ultimately enable and encourage the most heinous crime imaginable between siblings. Julia Domna, the so-called philosopher empress who surrounded herself with the greatest minds of her age, used her vast learning and cultural refinement not to elevate human civilization, but to provide sophisticated justification for the systematic destruction of family bonds and the murder of her own children. Domna's rise to imperial prominence had been built upon her marriage to Septimius Severus, a North African general whose military talents and political ambitions had carried him to the throne through the civil wars that followed the assassination of Commodus. She was not merely a decorative consort, but an active partner in imperial governance, wielding influence over policy decisions and establishing a court that became renowned throughout the empire for its intellectual sophistication and cultural achievements. The irony of Domna's legacy lies in the stark contrast between her public image as a patron of learning and philosophy and her private role as an enabler of the most brutal fratricidal violence in Roman history. She cultivated relationships with prominent thinkers, commissioned literary works, and positioned herself as a defender of classical culture and intellectual inquiry. Yet this same woman would use her philosophical training not to promote human dignity and moral behavior, but to rationalize and encourage acts of violence that violated the most fundamental bonds of human society. When Severus died in 211 AD, he left the empire to his two sons Caracalla and Geta, with explicit instructions that they should rule jointly and support each other as brothers and colleagues. This arrangement reflected not merely political necessity, but a father's desperate hope that his children might overcome their natural rivalry through cooperation and mutual respect. Domna was positioned as the guardian of this fraternal partnership, the maternal figure whose wisdom and authority could guide her sons toward effective collaboration. Instead of fulfilling this sacred responsibility, Domna immediately began manipulating the tensions between her sons for her own political advantage, apparently believing that a controlled conflict would allow her to maintain power by playing one brother against the other. She encouraged their rivalry rather than seeking to resolve it, feeding their suspicions and amplifying their conflicts in ways that made peaceful coexistence increasingly impossible. The philosophical education that Domna had provided for her sons became a weapon in their struggle for supremacy, as she had taught them to view power as the highest good and moral restraint as weakness unworthy of imperial rulers. Rather than instilling respect for family bonds or human dignity, her instruction had focused on the acquisition and maintenance of political control through any means necessary, creating a mindset that made fratricide not merely possible but intellectually defensible. When the tensions between Caracalla and Geta reached the breaking point, Domna made the catastrophic decision to support the stronger son rather than seeking to protect both of her children through negotiation and compromise. She provided Caracalla with intelligence about Geta's activities, helped him identify potential supporters who might be turned against his brother, and most chillingly offered philosophical justification for the murder that she knew was inevitable. The assassination of Geta was orchestrated with Domna's full knowledge and participation, carried out in her own presence during a family meeting that she had arranged under the pretense of reconciling the brothers. When Caracalla's assassin struck down Geta in her arms, Domna's reaction revealed the depths of her moral corruption. Rather than grieving for her murdered son or condemning his killer, she immediately shifted her support entirely to Caracalla, treating the fratricide as a necessary political action that deserved approval rather than condemnation. The psychological damage that Domna inflicted upon Caracalla through her enabling of his fratricidal crime would prove catastrophic for the empire as a whole. Having demonstrated that even the most sacred family bonds could be violated without consequence, Caracalla became increasingly paranoid and violent, seeing potential threats in every relationship and responding to imagined slights with brutal retaliation that terrorized the entire imperial administration. Domna's corruption of her surviving son extended far beyond mere political support to encompass a systematic program of moral destruction that transformed him from a potentially effective ruler into a psychopathic tyrant whose reign would be remembered primarily for its arbitrary cruelty and administrative chaos. She encouraged his worst impulses, provided intellectual justification for his crimes, and helped him rationalize behaviors that violated every principle of civilized governance. The massacre that followed Geta's assassination, in which thousands of his supporters were systematically hunted down and executed, was carried out with Domna's full approval and assistance. She provided lists of potential victims, helped identify their hiding places, and even participated in interrogations designed to extract information about other possible conspirators. Her philosophical training, which should have taught her to value human life and dignity, instead made her a more effective instrument of mass murder. Perhaps most tragically, Domna's intellectual gifts and cultural sophistication allowed her to present these crimes as expressions of political wisdom rather than moral failure, using her knowledge of classical literature and philosophy to construct elaborate justifications for actions that any decent person would recognize as fundamentally evil. As we reach the end of our journey through the darkest corridors of Roman imperial power, we are left to contemplate a terrible truth that echoes across the centuries, that some of history's most destructive forces have worn the faces of those who should have been civilization's greatest protectors. These women, born into privilege and blessed with intelligence, beauty, and unprecedented opportunities for positive influence, chose instead to become architects of chaos, using their gifts not to elevate humanity, but to satisfy their own insatiable hungers for power, revenge, and domination. From Livia Drusilla's methodical poisoning campaign that eliminated an entire generation of potential heirs, to Julia Domna's intellectual justification of fratricide, to Messalina's transformation of the imperial palace into a cesspit of corruption, each of these women contributed unique elements to a collective legacy of moral destruction that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever known. Their stories serve as permanent warnings about the catastrophic consequences that can result when power is divorced from virtue and when intelligence is employed in service of evil rather than good. The pattern that emerges from these narratives is both disturbing and instructive. None of these women were driven to their crimes by desperation, poverty, or ignorance. They possessed every advantage that wealth, education, and social position could provide, yet they consistently chose to use these advantages not to serve the greater good but to pursue personal gratification at the expense of others. Their evil was not the product of circumstance but of character, not the result of external pressure but of internal corruption that no amount of privilege or opportunity could remedy. Perhaps most chilling is the recognition that many of these women were genuinely intelligent and capable individuals who might have accomplished great things if they had chosen different paths. Livia possessed the strategic mind that could have strengthened the empire rather than undermining it through murder. Agrippina had the political acumen that could have guided wise governance rather than enabling tyranny. Cleopatra commanded resources and intellect that could have fostered peace and prosperity rather than civil war and destruction. The systematic nature of their crimes reveals another disturbing truth about the corruption of power, that evil once embraced tends to escalate and expand until it consumes everything within its reach. None of these women began their careers with plans for mass murder or imperial destruction. Instead, they started with smaller compromises, lesser betrayals, minor violations of moral principle that seemed justified by immediate circumstances. But each compromise made the next one easier. Each betrayal prepared the ground for greater treachery until they found themselves capable of acts that would have horrified their younger selves. The institutional damage these women inflicted upon Roman civilization extended far beyond their individual crimes to encompass a fundamental corruption of the principles that had made Rome great. They demonstrated that family bonds could be violated without consequence, that moral law could be subordinated to personal desire, that public office could be treated as private property, and that the welfare of millions could be sacrificed for the ambitions of a few. These lessons, once learned, could not be unlearned, creating precedents that future generations would follow to their own destruction. The psychological impact of their reigns upon the Roman people was equally devastating. Citizens who had been raised to believe in the nobility of imperial rule and the virtue of their leaders were forced to confront the reality that those they trusted most were often the most dangerous enemies of civilization itself. The cynicism and despair that resulted from this disillusionment weakened the social bonds that held the empire together, creating the conditions for the chaos and collapse that would follow. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of their legacy lies not in the destruction they caused, but in the opportunities they squandered. Each of these women lived at moments when wise leadership could have prevented enormous suffering and guided civilization toward greater heights of achievement and prosperity. Instead of seizing these opportunities for positive change, they chose to pursue narrow self-interest at the expense of everything noble and worthwhile in human society. The Rome that emerged from their collective reign of terror was a fundamentally different entity. from the civilization that had conquered the Mediterranean world through discipline, virtue, and respect for law. The institution of the Principate, which Augustus had designed to combine the efficiency of monarchy with the dignity of republican traditions, had been transformed into a tool for personal gratification and family vendettas. The administrative system that had governed vast territories with remarkable effectiveness had been corrupted by favoritism and incompetence. The military that had been the terror of barbarian tribes had been weakened by political interference and command structures based on loyalty rather than merit. In contemplating these stories, we are reminded that the preservation of civilization requires not merely the absence of evil, but the active presence of good, not merely the prevention of destruction, but the constant work of construction and renewal. These women failed not because they lacked the power to do good, but because they chose to use their power for evil. Their legacy stands as an eternal warning that privilege without responsibility, intelligence without wisdom, and power without virtue inevitably lead to the destruction of everything they touch. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late-night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter